You are listening to the podcast of the Mátyás Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at Corvinak.hu/en.
On today's MCC podcast, I think I'm going to have the first Latin American guest ever on every MCC channel. So welcome Rafael Godinez, our MCC Visiting Fellow this summer, and welcome to MCC Podcast especially.
Thank you, Péter, for having me, and thank you also to MCC for the opportunity.
Rafael, you're a PhD candidate at the Warwick Law School, and we have just discussed before we started recording that it's better that you explain your professional path, because if I miss out something, that's always, I'm not a lawyer. So please, if you could say a bit about your studies and your focuses and your professional interests.
Absolutely. I did my undergrad studies at Mexico in the Law School of National Autonomous University of Mexico. I did my master's studies, my LLM at Lund University, and currently I do my PhD at the University of Warwick, as you refer. I research on international investment arbitration. Currently at MCC, I'm researching the systemic bias on the decision-making of the arbitrators, but I'm interested also in a wide array of topics ranging from business ethics to other topics of international law, such as international human rights law and so on.
Can I ask, how did you find MCC and the application and this whole fellowship program?
About the program, I found it by an alumni of MCC.
Okay.
So he published it in the Facebook group of the European Forum ALBAC, which I'm a scholarship holder. So that's how I saw about the fellowship. Then I look at the scholars of the law school, and one of which is Professor István Varga, who is an expert in arbitration, which is my field of expertise.
And he was also a guest of MCC Podcast recently. So you already have, so indirectly you have like a common publication in audio format. So at least you are featured in the same program. It's already something.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. And I knew him I knew he is in Heltai, but because most of his work is Polish with the affiliation of Heltai. But then I discovered that he is here, and I was very excited to come here to MCC and research with him. And I'm also very thrilled that he's my mentor in the program.
And obviously we'll talk later about Latin-Amerika and not
Absolutely.
only the legal, but the economic and political situation there. But before that, there is something in between your work and Latin America and the American continent, because you co-edited a symposium piece, if I'm not mistaken.
I am. The symposium is taking place, so
Okay.
we already received the proposals, and we received some of the manuscripts, so we are editing them, and it will be published online in August.
Okay, so this is an ongoing project.
It's an ongoing project, yes.
Even better, and it's about the foreign direct investments in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And the exact title is it a blessing or a hyperbole?
Yeah.
Tell us a bit more about it, because this is a very good point to start off discussing the whole region from the perspective of foreign direct investments.
Absolutely. Thank you, Péter. So usually when we think about foreign direct investment, we think about the economic benefits that we receive from an investor that comes from overseas to the domestic market to start a new company, build a new factory, and so on. So we think about this as beneficial to the overall economy, right? They fill a gap that the domestic market cannot, because otherwise the domestic economy would have done it. So we need the foreign direct investment to increase or to fill in that gap, which in some instances also increases innovation, spurs entrepreneurship, and so on. So from that perspective, I think it's like the mainstream idea that we get from foreign direct investment. However, it's very important that we consider that that's not the whole picture. There are, according to the OECD benchmark definition, there are 3 types of foreign direct investment. So the first one I refer to is what it's called greenfield investments, right? The second one is debt, and the third one is mergers and acquisitions. What is happening in the region, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, is that most of foreign direct investment come from portfolio investment, which is mergers and acquisitions. It happened to Mexico in 2013. We had one of the largest brewers companies in the world, Grupo Modelo, the owner of the famous beer Corona, and it was sold to Anheuser-Busch. That was considered at the time, and for most people still, as something beneficial to the economy. But what they don't tell is that what happened was only an exchange of one class of assets for another class of assets. Similar as to when you sell your house, it's not that you are richer by selling your house. You exchange real estate asset for another asset, cash. And this is what happened, and it's what's happening in Latin America. And what's the symposium we want to criticize? Because the United Nations Agency for Latin America just last year published a report on foreign direct investment. They concluded that in the last decade, foreign direct investment has not contributed to the economic development and well-being of the region, because most of it comes from that type of investment, not from what we have in Mexico. And it's very important to remark, because this is not a condemnation to foreign direct investment, so FDI. We have a very prosperous manufacturing industry, especially in the car sector. But that's not the whole story. And this is what we're trying to show with the symposium, that not all the foreign direct investment is actually beneficial or brings those so-called benefits.
When it comes to foreign direct investment, or like global investment strategies in general, one can usually and normally think that, it's better to buy something, with simple words, it's better to buy something that has already been developed and then to get the benefits of that acquisition, for instance, than to go with the first category, buy something that I need to develop on the ground and then invest a lot more money maybe, not knowing exactly if it's going to worth it or not. So, this is the nature of foreign direct investment in this regard, if I understand it correctly. The question is, and this is what I wanted to ask you secondly, how can you control it if you can, or who are responsible for controlling it?
I think the fundamental problem, I think the fundamental problem is that this is not seen as a problem, right? So for governments in Latin American region, there is an incentive to receive that type of foreign direct investment, because it increases the balance sheet of the state. It increases the dollar reserves of that country. So in that sense, you can say, okay, it's beneficial for the country like Mexico that increases its foreign reserves, for other countries in the region as well. But that does not necessarily translate into the real economy. Right? So what is happening in other latitudes, such as China, and I know this might sound controversial, but China, what they do when they receive a foreign direct investment, say, you need to purchase raw materials here in China. You need to set up a factory here in China. You need to hire
Chinese. You need
Chinese,
to create 1,000
here in China.
Employment.
The West don't like this. First, this is, from a legal perspective, this is forbidden by WTO law. So the TRIPS agreement, TRIMS with M, TRIMS agreement, forbid this kind of practices. And also there is a network of bilateral investment treaties and free trade agreements that forbid that states engage in this kind of practice, in which they make demands to the investors to enter into the economy. Because we are operating in a mindset of welcoming all the investors, welcoming all the investments, because it's thought that all type of investments yield the same kind of output, But once we start to dissecting and understand that not all of them yield the same output for the real economy, maybe we will start asking questions to the investors and putting restrictions. But it's not until we actually understand, or the governments actually understand, that this is not beneficial in itself.
So what you're saying basically is currently there is no restriction in any Latin American countries when it comes to foreign direct investment.
That will be even crazy to think. Because the government, I work in the Directorate of Foreign Direct Investments in Mexico as sub-director. And when we announce the numbers of how much FDI Mexico received, we always sell it as a good thing. Right? We always, the more the better, because we don't dissect in what was invested. Right? What actually, whether benefited or not in the real economy, in the long term. Mexico received $2 billion for Grupo Modelo, but now we don't have Grupo Modelo. And what happened to that money? And all the earnings of Grupo Modelo now goes to wherever is registered Anheuser-Busch.
Yeah, I'm just thinking while hearing your thoughts that, for instance, just a very small example. I know this because of family stories that, for instance, in Panama, because there are many foreign companies, there are certain jobs that if you're not a Panaman citizen, you cannot simply get. For instance, you can be a doctor, you can be a dentist. I think you can be an engineer neither, because they are preserved for the citizens of Panama. So this, it would be basically the same logic applied on a country level, that there are certain areas or certain businesses that cannot be sold out.
It has created some benefits.
Okay, so let's talk about this.
So it has created. And in Mexico, I think what is interesting is that when they point out FDI, they say, okay, look what Volkswagen has done in Puebla. Look at what Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, like the big three car manufacturers in the US have done in Mexico. And yes, you see this, there's a real factory, like there's something tangible, right? But that's not the whole story. That's the thing. And in thinking in terms of for the electorate, it's very easy to fool people. All FDI is this factory, while that's just a small percentage of the whole picture.
Mm-hmm. And if we go away a bit from the restrictions or from this perspective and try to focus on the local solution, do you see any? I mean, what kind of strategies should governments follow in order to somehow fulfill that space? And so once they can fulfill that space and make their own investments, like local investments by Mexican companies, Argentinian companies, Chilean companies, and they wouldn't need to invite foreign investors to occupy that business or that gap, how could they do that, or how should they start it?
I think, I don't think that Mexico has enough leverage to, for instance, renegotiate a trade agreement with the US. We recently renegotiated NAFTA and we have the new USMCA. But we renegotiated because the US wanted a renegotiation of the treaty, not because Mexico wanted a better deal. I think that if Mexico would push enough, there might be some concessions from the US to Mexico. Also, if Mexico, because Mexico is the leader in the region, together with Brazil in Latin America. So if we will gather with the other Latin American countries to actually push an agenda at the WTO level, in which the TRIMS agreement will be renegotiated and states will have a more leeway to make those demands to investors, like you need to hire our workers, you need to buy our raw materials, you need to set up a factory, you need to transfer technology. That's what China is doing, and that's why the West don't like it.
Yeah, and sorry, that would be, I think, another very important additional question to this, that if, for instance, Mexico wouldn't be able to renegotiate the trade agreement with the US, or any other Latin American countries, they wouldn't be able to form a firm enough alliance to somehow, beat other international economic interests. Does the rise of China can somehow change the game?
It's changing the game. I think it's changing the game. But for a country like Mexico, I would say that geographically, it's very difficult for us to close or to make ties with China because it's simply against the U.S. interest. There was a project to build a train, probably the first train that was going to be built in Mexico in more than 100 years. And from Mexico City to the city of Querétaro, which is like the largest or one of the largest cities in Mexico after Mexico City. And it was going to be built by Chinese investors, and the project was canceled for dubious reasons. Which ones? I don't know, but we can speculate about whether the Mexican government received a call from the White House saying,
for instance.
Yeah, for instance. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not saying that's what happened, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's what happened.
Yeah, maybe we are never going to know it.
Yeah, well, maybe we're never going to. That's a speculation. I want to make clear that's a speculation, but that's what my hunch feeling is telling me.
Yes, and we stay in Latin America, but let's talk, using this opportunity to have you as our guest on MCC Podcast to talk a bit in a broader sense about the continent or this part of the American continent, because we see, even some countries rising in Latin America. For instance, Mexico is in some respects, as you've just said, with Brazil, are the leaders or the flagships of the Latin American continent or among Latin American economies. Chile is doing quite great. And there is the other side of the coin, Venezuela. Now Peru, we don't know what's going to happen after the recent elections, that they elected basically an openly Marxist-Leninist new leader as president of Peru. Colombia is becoming more and more fragile, not to mention the drug trafficking and all the Chinese, Cuban, Russian influence in the Caribbean. So it's a very complicated part of the world, but where shall we start if we want to understand it better?
You mentioned something about Chile, and I think it's interesting to recall that there was recently an election in Chile in which they voted for a majority to draft a new constitution, and that majority is mainly a left majority. So Chile has been the flagship of neoliberalism since the 1980s with General Pinochet. That's been an economic success to some extent, and it's difficult to contradict that. And I certainly see Chile as being one of the most prosperous countries in the region. And we see now during the COVID crisis that it was one of the countries with higher rates of vaccination, and economically it overperformed most of the countries. At the same time, what is happening is that people in Latin America are getting tired of the same old. And this was even acknowledged by President Piñera and say that this new vote, it's a reflection of the people getting tired of the elites and the elites being disconnected from the people. And I think that's... if
this is not only a Latin American issue.
That's not a Latin American issue exclusively, but I would say that in our region, we actually see very sharply, because in a country like Mexico, when you have a person like Carlos Slim, the fourth richest man in the world, but you can also see children walking barefoot selling bananas, I don't know how many countries can say that. And in Latin America, you see the same. In Chile, you see the same. And in Brazil, you have really rich people living in Sao Paulo, but if you dig a bit more, you can go to the favelas.
You can easily be shooting at the moment. Yeah.
So I think that's one of the biggest problems in the region, and it's demonstrated in the unsatisfaction of the Colombian people at the demonstrations that they are having. And probably what is happening in Peru. Again, this is not to say or endorse any ideology, but rather understanding this phenomenon, right, as a fact of what is going on in the region.
And what happened to Mexico? Because we have discussed earlier that you also had elections recently, actually a few days ago, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, in Mexico, we had elections on Sunday, midterm elections, and also local elections in certain parts of the country.
So in the beginning of June. Just to say out loud, because if someone listens to this podcast later, so June 2021, the first days of June, you had
the first Sunday of June. Good precision, Peter.
Yes.
And I think it was an endorsement for most of the people to the current administration. And I'm critical about the current administration,
which is of the left, or
if left is a left president. But what is happening in Mexico is that some of the problems that we have, which I would call systemic problems, in other words, they transcend the ideology of the ruling party, are blamed on the current administration. For instance, the war on drugs. This is something that didn't start with the current president, nor with the previous one, nor with the previous to that one. So this is something that in the 80s, right? So, but they are putting emphasis as if the problem is the current president. And if we continue labeling problems as ideological rather than systemic, we will never solve them. Because we had a right-wing party from 2000 to 2012. Then we have a center party from 2012 to 2018. Now we have a left-wing party. And the problem remains. So it's not ideological, but it's systemic.
And I also wanted to bring up this because you did some research on the ethical and legal aspects of human rights violations in international financial institutions.
Yes.
Could you tell us a bit more about that? Because this is also, I don't know if partly related to Latin-Amerika, but also very, well, not so frequently discussed one, but a very interesting.
Yeah, I want to make the precision. I collaborated in a group project with the head of the project is Professor Celine Tan of Warwick Law School. And we were working along with the independent expert, Juan Pablo Boholavsky. So just to be precise and to give credit to where credit is due, absolutely, right? The core of the project is to analyze whether international financial institutions, such as the World Bank or the IMF, are responsible for the human rights violations of the countries to which they lend money. So there was an instance, for instance, in Kenya, in which the World Bank loaned money to build an infrastructure project, a dam, and the problem was that they displaced an indigenous community in that region. So there was no enough due diligence prior to granting that loan to the Kenyan government. And in this due diligence, you need to secure that people, or the extent to which they will be affected, if they will be affected, how they will be compensated. So that's where we are putting emphasis, or the project put emphasis. And this is not something new as such, but we can see it in other international financial organizations, like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. They have a council on ethics, and this council advises the board in which companies they can or they cannot invest, based on a range of criteria. If the company in which they are investing has a track record of human rights violations, well, that's a necessary condition to de-invest in that company. So that's somehow the scope of the project.
I think what might be a difficulty with even regulate these sort of institutions is where do you draw a line? Because especially you mentioned an African instance. I mean, the Chinese are there and they don't care about human rights. They don't care about nothing. I was actually surprised that you mentioned an infrastructural project exercised or financed by IMF or the World Bank. Because they're usually like Chinese ones.
Yeah.
If you look at all the infrastructural projects going on African soil. So I don't know if there is even a balance between, letting non-Chinese investors or projects to run on African soil or to counterbalance the Chinese presence. And obviously, because, this is also a very important aspect to somehow avoid human rights violations.
Yeah, how to deal with China. China in Africa is a more recent phenomenon. The IMF and the World Bank has been since Bretton Woods Agreement, the end of the World War II. I would say, or my interpretation is that the phenomenon of China being a global lender, or similar or resembling what the World Bank and the IMF are, is the conditions that these institutions put in governments to receive the money. And here I'm not speaking about human rights. Here I'm not really speaking about that. I'm speaking about the World Bank asking governments to privatize the pensions. I'm speaking about the IMF telling to Greece, you need to privatize everything and you need to reduce the spending and all this kind of things. So it's natural that states are looking to other horizons to seek for money. That's dealing with the issue of how we counterbalance with China. That does not exclude that there is a human rights responsibility, right, from these financial organizations to understand and to foresee which are the consequences of the money that they are lending. And I think a very good model is the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. They put the example. You have a council on ethics. You have a defined set of guidelines that stresses which are the conditions for ethical investing.
Yeah, Rafael, there would be so many other topics to be discussed, but unfortunately our time is up. Thank you very much for coming here to Hungary to get to know us better and the work of MCC. We are very happy to have you here and to join me here on MCC Podcast.
Thank you, Péter, and again for the invitation to MCC. My time here has been incredible, an incredible learning experience of developing, engaging in very interesting discussions. I love this opportunity. Thank you.
Still a few weeks to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this MCC podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at Corvinak.hu/en.